Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Equity, Compassion, and Connection, a webinar about teaching strategies in the COVID-19 era. My name is Jody Fissler, and I am the Associate for Assessment Policy and Analysis at the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia, otherwise known as SHEV. I'll be your host for today's webinar, and I'm assisted by my SHEV colleagues, Kristen Whelan and Tierney Jackson. This is the first time SHEV has hosted a webinar to showcase the work of one of our cross-institutional faculty learning communities. We had 10 learning communities in the 2019-2020 academic year, and they were all looking at a variety of topics related to effective teaching. And of course, we had no idea at the beginning of the year that so many of these topics would become so much more relevant this semester. So I am just delighted that the members of this faculty learning community wanted to do this webinar to share what they've learned and allow other faculty around the state to benefit from the work they've done this year. Before we get started, I'd like to go over just a couple of technical and logistical items. First, all of you who are watching the webinar are muted automatically. We do encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation though. If you'd like to ask a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type your question. We've enabled the upvote feature in the Q&A window, which means you can click on the little thumbs up symbol to like someone else's question, and questions with the most likes will move up to the top of the list. That will help us decide which questions to address during the Q&A portion of the webinar. So I encourage you to scan the list of questions before typing your own in case someone else has already asked a similar question, and then you can just use the thumbs up to indicate your interest in the same question. Second, we are recording this webinar, and we will make both the recording and the slides available to everyone within the next several days. I'll send an email out to all of you once the recording is posted to let you know how to access it. And finally, the presenters are going to be using Slido at several points during the presentation to get your input on particular questions. You can get ready for that now by going to slido.com on your phone or your device and entering the event code, which you should be able to see in the green bubble at the bottom of your screen right now. We'll also repeat the code each time a Slido question comes up in the presentation, or you can access the questions just by pointing your phone camera at a QR code that will appear on your screen when those slides come up. I think that covers the logistics. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Jaime Lenihan from Germanna Community College, who served as the facilitator for this faculty learning community and who will introduce us to the rest of the team and begin the presentation. Jaime?
Hey, Jody. My name is Jaime Lenihan, and I'm an assistant professor of political science at Germanna Community College. I have had both the privilege and the pleasure of serving as the facilitator for this group. And I'm going to pass it over to Nicole Tong to introduce herself.
I'm Nicole Tong. I am the coordinator for the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning at Northern Virginia Community College, where I'm also a professor of English. And Beth?
Hello, I'm Beth Benson. I am a professor of English at Reynolds Community College in Richmond, Virginia. And Tom is next.
My name's Tom Geary, and I'm a professor of English at Tidewater Community College, Virginia Beach campus. And Monica, you're up.
Hi, I'm Monica McFerrin. I'm a professor of English and Humanities at the Virginia Beach campus of Tidewater Community College as well.
Thanks, everybody. So just to give you all a little bit of background about our group, we started working together at the beginning of this academic year. And our initial focus was to think about how equity issues impact the learning experience and how we can address those issues in our teaching strategies. And so our initial approach to equity was pretty broad. We were focused on factors such as gender and race and all of these different factors surrounding equity. And Beth is going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But you know, long story short, COVID-19 hit, and we had to make this really rapid transition to online instruction, as all of you did. And what we realized very quickly was that this was really magnifying existing equity issues, but it was also bringing up the fact that we were all dealing with equity challenges. So students that we hadn't previously seen dealing with equity issues all of a sudden were experiencing challenges related to equity. So some examples, were students that were having trouble accessing technology, who hadn't had issues with technology access before. All of a sudden, they're having to, share computers with family members. Students are dealing with mental health issues related to anxiety, and just general upheaval in their lives that was maybe not there before. So we really recognized that this was a moment where equity applied to everyone. And while equity is a big, multifaceted issue, our goal for today is to focus on those basic principles of equity and kind of how they can be applied in this current context of COVID-19. And our goal is to provide some practical strategies for those of you that are teaching online in summer and fall, really kind of concrete, realistic strategies in the areas of course design, course delivery, and assessment. So we want you to be able to kind of take away from this webinar something that you can pretty easily apply in your class. And we'll try to kind of specifically focus on that transition from face-to-face instruction to online instruction, and what that looks like and what the challenges are associated with that in our current public health environment. So Beth is going to talk a bit about definitions of equity, so I will pass it over to her.
Hi again. So when I wanted to talk a little bit about some ideas that we were discussing about equity and what that looks like in our current environment. When we began this FLC in the fall, our focus was on inclusive, equity-driven teaching practices and understanding what those practices might look like in a community college setting. I began the FLC knowing what a student-centered focus is and how that differs from a teacher-directed focus. And then as our discussion moved toward equity or evolved with equity, we also began to think about redesigning physical practices in the classroom and redesigning assignments and syllabi. So with the focus on disproportionate access to education, the definition from the AACU from Step Up and Lead for Equity addresses equity-mindedness, meaning, and focusing on equality, meaning sameness, and making sure everyone gets the same thing, and also focusing on equity, meaning fairness, ensuring that each person gets what he or she needs. Next slide, please. While many approaches to and definitions of inclusive, equity-driven teaching practices focus primarily on disabilities or race and gender, community college classrooms move beyond this to acknowledge a student body that includes traditional, non-traditional, disabled, first-generation, multilingual, minority, LGBTQ, dual enrollment, and veteran students. Defining an inclusive, equity-driven pedagogy that addresses this type of diversity is not without challenges. But now, what do equity and equality look like during COVID-19? With an uncertain future ahead of us, the VCCS Chancellor, Glenn Dubois, called for the creation of a task force to plan for post-pandemic life in academics. As we try to define what inclusive, equity-driven pedagogy might look like in the time of COVID-19, Chancellor Dubois' comment that we are nimble and innovative as we continue to work with a diverse student population is not to be taken lightly. Next slide, please. The Achieving the Dream equity statement is a strong statement about inclusive, equity-driven teaching practices in higher education. While Achieving the Dream's focus is on community colleges, as is the focus for this FLC, COVID-19 has been a reminder of the challenges educators often face when ensuring equal access and success in any post-secondary environment. What has become most prominent in our minds now is that many of our students, along with faculty, were forced into an online environment under and unprepared, oftentimes without access to the technology and skills to be successful in what is now becoming the new norm. With this in mind, this presentation will focus on practical pedagogy during COVID-19 with respect to design, delivery, and assessment. So at this point, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Nicole Tong.
Thank you, Beth. All right, it's time for Slido. So if you have your cellular device, you can open up your camera and take a picture of this QR code, and you're going to see the question that we see on the screen here. What non-academic factors do you consider when designing your courses? I'll give you a few minutes to answer. You can also answer by typing in slido.com and using the code 9761. We have answers from nearly half of our participants. Would love to see answers from the other half. All right, some definite patterns are emerging. The more an idea is represented, the bigger the word appears on our screen here. So some definite patterns with engagement, the ability to engage with the course content using and harnessing technology, the time that a student might have to dedicate to the class, what their work lives might look like, what their family responsibilities might be. Some of these periphery ones hold true too. Their transportation issues, their previous lives, the content and the experiences that they bring to the class in terms of their course preparation, but also in terms of their lived experiences such as trauma, the community in which they're learning, the community in which they live. So these answers are wonderful. Access, we're definitely going to talk a little bit about access. The cost of materials is coming up, and OER is up here. So in addition to considering the content of the class, thinking about the myriad ways that students can access that content using resources that might not, inhibit them financially. Thank you all so much for answering. Next slide, Jamie. When designing courses, I would ask you to consider clarity in your expectations and also be clear about what students could expect of you in turn. In particular, when we're in a remote environment, students aren't necessarily going to be working with you in real time. And so the ability for students to access content in myriad places on Canvas, vis-a-vis email, in whatever ways that might suit them the best. One moment. And then the next two frameworks, TILT and Universal Design for Learning, offer opportunities that benefit all students with particular benefit for underserved students. The TILT framework provides the purpose, task, and criteria for evaluation, which was vetted through a TILT study. And that benefits all students because students become aware of the purpose that they're learning something. And then accessibility, universal design for learning, allows all students to benefit with particular benefit for students with disability. Next slide, Jamie.
All right. Now it is time to invite everyone to participate in another Slido poll. So again, you can join the poll by holding your phone up to the QR code or going to slido.com and entering 9761. So this poll is asking, what strategies do you use to balance flexibility in your courses with enough rigor to keep students on track to finish the course? We have responses from a little over half of our participants, so we'll take another moment so that the rest of our participants can share their thoughts. And again, there are some definite strong themes that are emerging here. Assignments, flexible deadlines, communication, and all of these things are so important for helping students develop autonomy in their courses, giving them the ability to work around all of the different things that they have going on in their lives. I see Zoom and videos, and as we kind of try to think about how we can incorporate the use of technology into our online courses, especially as we're transitioning from face-to-face teaching to remote or online education, the use of things like videos and Zoom can really help students to connect with the class. It can give them more flexibility. So what we're going to think about at this point is how we can incorporate equity into our course delivery. And when we think about equity in course delivery, I would really encourage you to think about how you can build flexibility and autonomy for students into your course. The more we can structure and deliver a course with a focus on autonomy and flexibility, the more we can start to address some of those equity challenges that students are encountering in the COVID-19 environment. So a lot of you posted in the Slido about flexible deadlines. And I've recently started using this sort of priority extended due dates framework. And this is essentially just 2 different due dates for the same assignment. And a priority due date might be one where I say, if you turn it in by this date, you have the chance to revise and resubmit, or I will give you more detailed feedback. Whereas the extended due date for that same assignment would be, you turn it in by this extended due date and maybe you don't have the opportunity to revise and resubmit, but you have more time to complete it. So that gives students the autonomy to decide what they want from the assignment. Do they want more time, or do they want that opportunity to revise or more feedback? And it also gives them the flexibility to plan around their changing schedules, while also allowing you to plan your workflow. Another strategy that you can think about is the use of free passes, or basically just a set number of assignments that students can skip. I think a lot of us probably use this practice, but we might not think of it in terms of equity. But it really does support equity, because we have to expect that as we are moving into this environment where students might be dealing with a lot of upheaval in their lives, that they are going to have some off weeks. They're going to have unpredictable schedules. They or their family members might be ill. They're just likely to be a lot more distracted in general. And if you have a lot of like lower stakes assignments, such as journals or quizzes or discussion boards, and you say, I'm going to drop the lowest 2 or the lowest 3, that allows students to skip some of those without it throwing off their grade. And it recognizes that students are dealing with all of these different competing priorities. And that gives them the autonomy and flexibility to say, you know what, this week I really need to prioritize my kids or whatever is going on in my life. A lot of you posted about videos, and mini lectures are a great way to give students a way to access course material at a time and place that works for them. You can think about short pre-recorded videos of main course concepts, or maybe the main concepts that students tend to struggle with, and this will allow them to return to those videos at their convenience. Another thing to think about is how you use synchronous opportunities in your courses. One of the things that I think a lot of us are aware of is that with our first generation college students, they're not always knowledgeable about the culture and norms and kind of vocabulary of college. We may have to explain what a syllabus is, or what office hours are. And just as we recognize that we need to provide that clarity to our first generation students, we need to recognize that we're bringing our students into a new environment with online learning, and particularly with video conferencing. So we should make our expectations clear for how our Zoom sessions are going to run, what is appropriate conduct in a Zoom session. This will help them to feel more comfortable and more confident participating in those synchronous opportunities, and they'll stay more connected to the course. And then finally, multiple methods of communication. So we want to make sure that we are, accommodating different communication styles. And some students are really going to need that human interaction over Zoom or a phone call. They're going to need that connection with you. But other students may just want that quick response over a chat tool or an email. So if you have multiple ways that students can get in touch with you, it will establish your presence in the course. It'll support autonomy and flexibility for students, because they can decide what works best for them in terms of reaching out to you. And they'll be more likely to stay connected to the course throughout the semester. So now I'm going to turn it over to Monica and Tom, who will talk about equity in course assessment.
Thanks, Jamie. Before we start that conversation, we've got another Slido question. And this one looks at obstacles. So what obstacles might your students encounter when they're completing your online assessments? What kind of barriers might they run into? Oh, Wi-Fi, that's definitely a point. Kids working. Literacy, I saw that. That's a really great point.
Seeing work schedule as well, which is a really good one. I have so many students right now who are working many more hours than they're used to.
Absolutely. Time management, that is such a big issue when we make a transition, especially for students who have been taking face-to-face classes. Oftentimes, we have, as Jamie, Nicole, and Beth have all mentioned, we've got a lot of online students, not by choice right now. Many students have taken online classes intentionally, and many students have taken face-to-face classes intentionally. They know enough about themselves to know that they needed that face-to-face engagement in class. And some of that does tag back into literacy, which is a good point. Many people have learning styles where they need to really be engaged face-to-face. It's hard to read and sort of get the same content. And part of that is that when we teach online, we often have a different voice, right? We all have an academic voice. And when we write things, we have our academic hats on. When we talk to students, we have our human hats on. And oftentimes that translates differently. And so a student may not hear an assignment when you type it the same way they would if you presented it face-to-face in class. Give a few more minutes or a few more seconds to see. We've got about a little over half in there. Anxiety.
I saw comprehension as well. One of the big things I'm missing about face-to-face classes right now is seeing students' body language when they nod their heads, or when I could tell that there's a connection there. And right now we're lacking that in so many ways, unless we have the synchronous Zoom time with them.
I have one of those obstacles right now. I've got lots of loud jets going over, so that may make it hard to hear. We live those obstacles when we teach as well. So let's go ahead and leave the Slido and go to the next slide. So we know that assessment is important. We know that it's sort of the key to make sure that our students are getting the material, prepared to move on to their next course, prepared to earn their degrees. When we look at assessment in this sort of time of distress that we have, and we can look at it now and say we're almost done with the spring semester. We know many of us will be still teaching remotely over the summer. We're unsure as to what's happening in the fall, but I also think we need to perceive all of this as a real long-term issue. Students are going to have residual conflicts and residual things that they're dealing with for potentially years with this, when you're dealing with illness, unemployment, a lot of changes in their lives. So we need to look at this as a bit of a bridge situation, not necessarily always our long-term best practices, but keeping that idea that we are being compassionate with our students, that we are making sure we're removing their obstacles to success when it comes to completing the assessment. That's something that we can ingrain in our teaching. So not necessarily thinking of that as a temporary fix, but maybe as a permanent shift in our perception, because our students don't have to tell us when they're struggling. Looking at it in times like this, where we just assume that perhaps they all are in some ways. Jamie mentioned that a lot of students who have accommodations already are going to struggle because those accommodations aren't in place. There's a lot of change with that and they have to adapt. A lot of students who maybe didn't perceive themselves as having equity issues in the past are now finding themselves struggling with accessibility. We had a comment earlier about the idea of discussing people who are suffering from unemployment, struggling with that, single parents who are now dealing with having to manage their children and teaching their children. So we have a lot of conflicts that students are having to deal with when it comes to being able to accurately display the learning that has taken place in the course throughout the time. So what we're looking at here is looking at what those outcomes are. What are the outcomes in the course? And making sure that we're assessing that content, there's my chat, making sure we're assessing that content really clearly. One of the strategies for that is to really focus on formative assessments for students. It's difficult to give, if you've traditionally taught in a way that you're exam-based, it's very difficult to give exams in a circumstance where a proctor may not be available or it may not be practical. There's been a lot of concern about how to check on things like, are students being, having academic integrity with things? Is there cheating going on? Focusing on formative assessments where you can give feedback, get a real understanding of what a student knows before, and building to those summative assessments, is a strategy to be able to approach those, cutting back on large, high stakes assessments. Because when students' anxiety is high, we know that they don't do as well on those high stakes assessments. And we also know that they can be the type of thing that causes them to drop away from the class, that their anxiety around something like that can be just too great, and they perhaps may give up. Looking at things that are checking in participation, keeping them engaged, but allowing those things to be graded with a complete, incomplete. You did it, good job. Sometimes a sentence or two in a discussion, that may be all a student can manage, but getting them into that class and getting them engaged in that is going to keep them moving forward. So having that sense of validation is good in that regard. And I have had a lot of success with that idea of walking through assignment instructions on video. I know that some of us may be reluctant. This may not be in our comfort zones to have video recordings of things, but short video recordings, if you're not comfortable with your face, audio recordings, having the screen up where you've got the assignment available where they can read through and you're walking them through it. Having your voice tell them what to do reinforces what you find important in an assignment, the places where you might normally in a classroom have given more explanation. That comfort level really increases a sense of understanding of what you're looking for. And that same thing works when you're giving feedback. Audio feedback, that's a really great way of, and it's also a little faster to grade, right? If you're doing audio feedback or video feedback and you can walk through a student's paper and talk about it, they're going to understand that. They're going to engage with that more than they might with a lot of copious notes on a sheet of paper. I also conference grade some things. Flexibility was one of the words that popped up a lot when we talked about how we balance flexibility and rigor. Flexible deadlines are important, but also flexible ways of approaching grading with students. Some students want that paper feedback. As Jamie was saying, some students really are all about that written feedback. Some of them want to talk to you about their paper, scheduling Zoom appointments, short ones to go through. It may seem like it takes a lot of time to do that, but getting in and having a 20-minute Zoom conference with a student that will then avoid them sending 15 emails that still don't get to the crux of what the issue is actually going to help that student move forward a little bit more effectively. Tom, did you want to add to any of that?
Yeah, build on some of Monica's ideas here. First of all, I also use flexible deadlines. And in fact, because I teach English, I feel like most of the deadlines in my class are really arbitrary. So for me, for submissions well after the deadline, especially in a situation like this. Sorry if my internet connection here is a little unstable. You guys might have lost me for a second there, but I keep my deadlines soft throughout the semester, except to the very end of the semester, because I need to be able to have a certain amount of time to grade those submissions. Some other things that I use to build on these great ideas here already in the slide is I do use small videos as walkthroughs as well. Canvas Studio has been really great for that over the course of this semester. I already used them for online classes anyway, so being able to integrate those into what was my face-to-face class in this, I think, has really helped students but not be forced into a situation where they're in a synchronous room where they may not be able to avoid distractions or have weak Wi-Fi. Videos can watch those and they don't have to deal with a whole lot of buffering has been important. And really trying to capture the essential parts of the assignment. I've been trying to go back to assignments and say, what can I cut out? What can I do to make it easier? One of the things I did, for example, is my face-to-face class usually has a 10-minute presentation at the end of the semester. And it's kind of hard to say, well, go ahead and just record yourself, because some students don't have that luxury. They may not have a webcam, or they might not be able to upload it because it's going to take 2 or 3 gigs. So instead, I've changed it to an option where they can still present, or they can write a 1-page analysis of somebody's elocution abilities in some kind of TED Talk or another video from AmericanRhetoric.com or some other website where they can find a speech. So making sure they're still meeting those course outcomes, still backward designing to see if it's meeting the objectives of the modules and the key assignments of the class has been important. But also keep the version over the course of the semester, and they can revise it as many times as they need to. That's something that I kind of found about myself over several years, not just during this time, but I found that it's beneficial for giving students that opportunity to apply the feedback and to also have a second chance just in case there's comprehension issues, particularly during a time like this where I know that sometimes there's a lost connection there with them. I think we can get to the next slide now, Jamie.
I wanted to real quick answer a question though, because I saw a couple.
Sure.
The idea of a qualitative submission versus a quantitative submission, several people have sort of voiced concerns that I've heard about the idea that if you just give quantitative submissions, you're giving multiple choice tests, you're giving Googleable kind of tests, I've apparently made up that word, you're giving these tests that they can just get in there and Google, that's not necessarily going to be a substantive assessment. But when you give a qualitative submission, something that doesn't just ask to repeat information, but that has an element of analysis where they're processing content, where they're able to show that they understand, not just that they repeat, but they understand material, that's what we're looking at when I talk about qualitative submissions.
And I want to add one more thing also before we move into the in Washington. He posted this just 2 days ago. He tweeted, "Turned in grades today, every single student got an A. One of them earned their grade." And then I'm kind of skipping to later tweets here. He had a chain of tweets. Ask yourself, what grade could these students have gotten in any other term? No student should be punished for struggling amidst a pandemic. We've all struggled. That struggle has not been distributed equally. The students from marginalized populations possibly struggled more, or probably struggled more. And I found his tweet to be very important because we have to consider what would students have accomplished just in the first half of the semester alone. What were they on track for? What kind of things have they lost during this situation that really may have affected how their grade turned out? I know I had some fantastic students who have either dropped off and I'm not seeing them participate as much, or their work has suffered, and I've seen that in terms of quality. But I got a good sense of who they were early in the semester, and I saw them still trying. So that may factor into how we're grading things as well, whether that's something in holistic grading, or if you're using a rubric, or if it's something else, having some kind of lenience. Okay, we can go to the next slide now. For real this time. So some of the self-reflection questions that we wanted you to think about, some self-inquiries, things that get you starting to think about equity and how it may start with you and how you already use equity in your classroom. The first of those is, how do you understand yourself as an instructor? How do you interact with your students? I know this is a question that Monica and I have talked about endlessly for a while now, really all throughout this faculty learning community, since our offices are like 15 feet apart. We're constantly talking about, what does it mean for me to be a compassionate instructor? What situations do I apply this? What does that look like? And as this pandemic has arrived and hit us all, it really made us look a lot more at, okay, so now how do we apply these things consistently? And how do we do these things and take it even further? In what ways can we really help our students? So how do you understand yourself as an instructor? You don't necessarily have to answer this one right now, but if you want to start self-reflecting, jotting down some notes, I think it's a great starting point to use these questions. The second is, how do you implement equity-based teaching strategies in your instruction? So what things are you already doing in the classroom? In what ways do they address equity in terms of race, gender, disability, and or socioeconomic status? Those are some of the larger categories we want you to kind of keep in mind there. They're things that we should be thinking about not only during this kind of situation, but in general with our instruction. What obstacles have you and your students faced during the COVID-19 pandemic? This might hit us all differently depending on where you are. I know that if you teach at different institutions, you may have different policies in place. You may have different student populations. A lot's going to change and a lot will vary depending even just on what you teach and how that's going to look in the classroom. So what obstacles have you faced and what kind of things has that presented for you? And then what are your assumptions about your students? One of the things we're going to share with you in the next slide is a list of resources that we've gathered throughout our faculty learning community. And one of those resources is the Implicit Association test from Harvard. That implicit association test is a series of different tests and quizzes you can take, and they help you examine your beliefs and attitudes on a variety of topics like religion, sexuality, race. It's a really good starting point for implementing equity and to really kind of find some surprising results possibly about who you are and about how you already have certain beliefs and attitudes about different things. Next slide. So we gathered a list of resources and annotations. I believe that overall we counted there's over 60 sources overall. Some of these are annotated, some of these have notes and quotations. Some of these are just the URLs themselves, but we gathered all this in one giant Google Doc and we used URL shortener to try to make it a little bit easier for you guys. But that website is bit.ly, so bit.ly/2W RUBDW. I realize it's not the easiest, but it's shortened at least, and you'll be able to go back to that. We'll also push that out in the Q&A as well so that you can click on that link instead. We would like for you to add your own ideas for resources as well. If you have other resources that you found very useful or that you may be informed by during this pandemic or in general in your instruction with equity-based teaching strategies, we'd love those resources. We'd be glad to add those to this as a larger set of resources that we can all utilize collectively.
All right. Thanks, Tom. So we would really like to express our thanks to Chev for supporting the work of our faculty learning community. Chev organized these faculty learning communities, brought our group together, and the experience of working together over the course of this year has been wonderful, and particularly over the last 2 months. I think I speak for all of the members of this group when I say they've definitely been a source of support as we kind of enter into this uncharted territory of trying to teach during a pandemic. And we would also like to thank Chev and particularly Jody Fizzler for hosting this webinar. None of the members of this community had hosted a webinar before. We didn't exactly know what we were getting into. But Jody has been wonderful at taking our idea and running with it and making it happen. So we're very grateful, and we thank both Jody Fizzler and Chev. Now I will pass it back to Jody for Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Jaime, and thanks to all of you. It was really great information, and we've had a lively discussion going on in the Q&A. Thanks to all of you for adding your questions and your comments and responding to each other. One of the issues that has come up frequently is about parameters for synchronous sessions. So, should these be mandatory? How long? How often? Do you have any examples of ground rules in synchronous learning, ground rules for Zoom? And would you consider using synchronous opportunities in a class that's otherwise asynchronous?
So I think all of our institutions probably are going to have different approaches to this and give us different guidance. I have personally found that about an hour is the limit that my students do well with. But some of the things that that make the synchronous sessions work a little bit better is setting up some preparation beforehand. So asking the students to come prepared with a question that they have, or building off of an asynchronous activity that they've already completed. Nicole, I know that you have had a different experience with the synchronous classes. So do you want to tell us about the strategies you've been using?
Sure, I taught in a 16-week format this semester, but I also taught an 8-week class that began with the pivot to online instruction. So that class in particular, so much more important to build in opportunities for student engagement because we had no prior framework for understanding each other. There were more group opportunities from the start than maybe there would have been in a traditional class. So just thinking about how students need to be able to interact with the content, they need to be able to interact with you as their instructor, and they might need multiple methods to do this: email, Canvas announcements, things like that, video chats back and forth, and then ways that they can interact with one another. So thinking about those 3 things really has been beneficial in helping the students kind of make the most of a semester that was wholly remote. And some of your summer semesters might be starting to look like they'll be this way, wholly remote.
When it comes to ground rules for Zoom too, I think this is a good opportunity to give a little bit of professional communication content to students in all of our classes, looking at making sure they look at their surroundings, that it's appropriate, that they're not gonna be displaying things that other students shouldn't see, that they're in a classroom when they're in Zoom. So that also means not being a stickler about requiring their video to be on. I know there's been a lot of controversy about whether we make their video on or not. And I know we kind of like having that nodding and the head bobbing or being able to see the faces, but there might be a reason that a student has their video off. They may not have a private space to be able to participate. They may be sharing a computer in a common space, or they may have other things going on, noise around them. So if you want to make sure that they are participating, there are options where they can show thumbs up on the screen, or where they can participate in the chat, where they're able to engage without actually having to have that video on. But having some rules about their professional appearance, making sure that they're fully clothed, that all of that stuff. It seems like you wouldn't have to say that, but having that conversation just sort of gets it off of the, you know, the issue list in the very beginning.
We've had another question that a number of people have upvoted, and that goes back to, Monica, something you were talking about with the qualitative submissions. And what your thoughts are on rigorous rubrics for evaluating those qualitative assignments.
So that's a great question. I have really detailed rubrics, and oftentimes when it comes to feedback for students in an online class, even before all of this, I have really detailed rubrics which break down what everything is. And if you're using Canvas, and prior to this Blackboard, and I know I've seen D2L as well, so there are a lot of formats that have the opportunity to do that. I will use those rubrics. I make them available to students while they're doing their assignments so that they can use those as sort of pre-submission reviews. And then, so that's a valuable thing because it does give them feedback. And then I couple that with some individualized feedback and also an opportunity to have personal conferences, Zoom conferences. I always have Zoom office hours for them to pop into to be able to get to expand on that. But sometimes the rubric is enough, and that does give you sort of a break when you're grading 100 papers for something, that if you can go through and give them that rubric feedback.
Also, that framework that I was mentioning in the slide about course delivery, you're welcome, you all are welcome to take a look at that website, which is tilthighered.com. And you can look at the ways in which folks have revised assignments to become more transparent. I would recommend the sociology assignment, which is, I think they call it assignment A under resources and examples. That assignment very front loaded, lots of background information, and then it finally got to the point of what students were actually supposed to do. And in the revision, putting the purpose first, a clear task, and then putting all that background stuff that a student might need or a few students might need in the back really did a lot of wonders for helping students see the clarity of why they were being asked to do something, what knowledge and skills they would gain in doing it, and then how they would be evaluated, as Monica was stressing with the rubrics.
Okay. On another question, I guess, Tom, you had talked about flexible grading. When you're thinking about flexible grading, do you mean more than just providing a window of dates, or like what Jamie was talking about, having a preferred date and an extended due date for things? Is there more to it than that?
First of all, before I answer, I just want to let you guys know if I start breaking up, I'll try to turn my video off. I'm sorry. I didn't realize how bad it was during my session there. But for me, it's really about both flexible deadlines and then also thinking about how students met the core concepts of the assignment versus how I usually would approach it. So I grade a lot of essays, a lot of written things rather than exams and quizzes and stuff. But when they're writing those essays, when they're writing the rhetorical analyses, I try to see if students are grasping really the key things that I need them to know. And the way that I'll approach it is going to be maybe a little bit less strict than it would be in a normal kind of situation, a normal semester, but I'll still try to connect it back to the key rubric criteria and see if they're using research appropriately, if they're citing things properly, if they're still able to use the correct terminology, if they're really having sound anthematic structure. But I think my approach towards it is that if I try to grade then students are going to not revise it, having enough problems right now, even doing work and having the discipline to keep going back to things. But really, a lot of it comes back to flexible deadlines and allowing them to revise as much as necessary.
Looks like Tom might have frozen a bit there. Sorry about that. So we had a couple of questions on students with disabilities and accommodations.
Okay.
I'm sorry, someone else jumping in?
I can answer that.
Okay.
I saw just how might faculty be sort of leveraging those resources differently during this time. I think it's important now to be as proactive as possible in asking students what they need and in advertising what's available to them. So if your college has a COVID page for students that recommends some best practices for their learning, going remote, to share that with them because they may not know where to look for those things. And then advertising the services that are still available to them in a remote environment, from tutoring to library instruction to testing procedures to access to accommodations. We were saying at the beginning that folks who may need an accommodation at the beginning of the semester, that may only amplify in a remote situation. And so getting those requests in early so that students can have the opportunity of using those. An example might be a student with sensory disabilities might have trouble if you're constantly sharing screens and switching from one screen to another screen. And so something that you might do is offer all the handouts before the class begins so that students have time to process that information on a sensory level before they're in the high stakes environment of a synchronous session.
Someone had a question about the assessment on perceptions, Tom, that you talked about. Is that in your bit.ly your resource document? I assume that might mean the implicit bias tests.
Yeah, it is.
Great.
Sorry, I didn't hear the full question. I was great, sir.
I was just going to say, you can actually get that on the Harvard IAT website as well, the implicit associations test. There's a lot of really interesting options on that test. I actually have several of different classes that I teach, my humanities classes. I have my students take it as well because it's a very useful self-reflection tool.
I was trying to answer a question and I got lost. The question got lost there, but it came from Vanessa. And she was asking about, or stating that not all equity issues can be solved from more resources. And so could we talk a little bit more about that? And so I thought that might be a worthy way to spend another minute or two thinking about that observation.
I saw that question as well, Nicole, and I thought it was a really good question. You know, one of the things that has been the biggest challenge about making this shift to online instruction has been the fact that students don't have internet access, they don't have computers, you know, and so it feels like you're going online and yet you have nothing. How are you supposed to teach them? And I think, I know at Germana, and I'm sure this is the case at most institutions, that we do have resources available for students. You know, they can borrow Chromebooks. We have Wi-Fi in our parking lots. There's a lot of community resources that have been put out there, and yet students might not be aware of this. So I really think the first step that we need to take and make sure that we're doing is making our students aware of the resources that our institutions have and the resources that our communities have, because they may not know. I think, Nicole, you mentioned, you know, a COVID-19 page, right? If your institution has a COVID-19 page, make sure that your students know that it's there. Tell them what's on it. Say, if you need a computer, if you need food, you know, here are the resources that the college or the university has for you, because they literally may not be aware, and they may be too overwhelmed to figure out how to ask.
And then I think this is too where compassion comes in. You know, opening up the possibility that students might have something other than the course to talk about in terms of how they're feeling, and going through the proper channels of what reaching out and mental health support might look like from your institution's point of view, and following through with these processes, even when students aren't face-to-face, I think is even more essential. You know, I know at Northern Virginia Community College, we have a CARES report. And so there's a whole team of folks that can help me help a student who might be in need of more than they would in a different face-to-face environment.
We have just 2 minutes left before the hour, so I just want to give an opportunity for any of you to give some final closing thoughts at this point.
I'll say something. I've been pretty quiet as everybody's been contributing. I didn't want to jump in and interrupt anyone. I do want to reiterate what Nicole said about compassion, because that is part of the title to our presentation, compassion and connection. And I want to stress, you know, as we pivoted to the online environment for COVID-19, I think we learned a lot about how to work with our students. The access issue was the first thing to bubble up, I think, for many of us. You know, students for me personally, contacting me, you know, I live in a rural area, I don't have internet out there. How do I continue in your class? I can't pay for the internet. I have to go sit in the McDonald's parking lot. And then I watched our institution pivot to try to help those students with our COVID-19 page, but also, you know, making adjustments within the buildings to move the routers to the outer edges so students could come to our parking lot and possibly use the internet in their cars. It just sounds so otherworldly when you think about it in that way. But I feel like that idea of compassion, connection, thinking about our students beyond just being non-traditional or disabled or a veteran, but students who are really trying to reach a goal. And all of a sudden, this huge obstacle of COVID-19 hit us in the face, and that sort of felt insurmountable for many of them. And I think that a lot of us, most of us, we've kind of rallied together and tried to support each other and work through a lot of those issues. So I'm sorry I didn't talk more, but I really, that idea of compassion, connection with our students is really important for us.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful way to close out the webinar. I'd like to thank all of our presenters, first of all, for your great work. And thanks to all of you who attended for spending the hour with us. I hope you found it worthwhile. And again, I will be in touch soon with a link to the recording as well as with the slides from the slide deck. So with that, I just wish everybody a great afternoon and a good rest of your week. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.